Hello, and welcome to my presentation on Stigma Towards Polyamorous Relationships by Vicente Carbajal Jr. for the class of Sociology 354. Polyamory shares similar stigma with same-sex couples. So given that statement, let's dive into just a little bit of history as to where it came from. So the existence of polyamory emerged during the 1980s after the sexual revolution. It was during this period of social and political turmoil that it emerged as an identity and form of family. Now, there hasn't been a whole lot of research into this form of family simply because it is an interesting topic, but it also, as mentioned, has a lot of stigma associated with it, which causes some difficulties in trying to actually research it and getting participants for it. Now, the term itself is difficult to define, but it can be described as a form of relationship in which people openly court multiple romantic, sexual, and/or affective partners. Now, this is usually studied alongside same-sex couples and the LGBTQ community when doing research, which moves into the idea that they have similar stigmas as those groups. I argue that polyamorous families are harmed due to the stigma society places on non-monogamous relationships. The way that polyamorous families deal with the stigma is through the following. They consider being polyamorous as private and sensitive information and only choose to disclose such information to people that they feel comfortable around. Secondly, they practice polyamory in an isolated environment. A good example of this was shown in the research when couples would go to a specific community because they knew that they were more open-minded and accepting of their relationship. Thirdly, they innovate new roles and language to best deal with custodial issues. When being in a polyamorous relationship, especially when they're going to have a child or children, it is difficult to give a label to certain family members, especially when the biological father has already been named. One way to deal with this is to create the new role or the new term of being a co-parent or being a co-father in that situation. The first strategy to deal with stigma is treating polyamory as private and sensitive information. In a study conducted by Rubinsky in 2018, there was a survey with 158 participants. There was one open-ended question that asked, how, if at all, have you discussed your polyamory with your family? Now, these answers could range from not disclosed to complete disclosure. What was found is that 75% of the total participants had at least one or more family members that they told about their relationship. Now, this is a sizable chunk. That's 120 participants from the 158. Now, only 26% of the 158 participants fully disclosed their relationship. So a much smaller percentage told their whole family versus a large majority who only told one or more members. Now, on the opposite side of this, less than 20% of the participants said they have not told their families or they are on a need-to-know basis. Now, the requirement for the need-to-know basis was described as people who have not really told their family about their relationship or simply claim that their family have not asked them about their relationship, so feel no need to actually disclose it. In the same study by Rubinsky, there was an interview portion that was done with 13 participants, half of which were taken from the prior survey questions. This was a semi-structured interview that had questions similar to the ones below. Describe your relationship with your family. Have you told your family about your relationship? Why or why not? There were many other questions asked, but these were the most common ones, seeing as it was a semi-structured interview that meant the interviewee could ask a variety of questions. One commonality that was found was that culture seemed to play a big part in whether or not someone told their family. And as we've seen from the results, people in polyamorous relationships tend to try and keep their information private unless they feel that there isn't a lot of stigma associated with telling others, such as their family. So we can see how this strategy is used to prevent stigma when it isn't overly necessary. The second strategy used to dealing with stigma is practicing polyamorous relationships in an isolated environment. In a study in 2012 done by Aguilar, participation, observation, and in-depth interviews were used to investigate two egalitarian intentional communities. One had about 100 members and the other had 23 members. Only 32 people were used as participants for the interview. They were picked by putting up bulletin board posts in the community and asked to participate in a 2-hour study that paid about $8 an hour to make up for the loss of work. Now, the community conditions seem to help create an environment in which polyamory thrived. This was in part by most of the members, over half, in the interview claiming that they had either participated in polyamorous relationships or were in a polyamorous relationship. It seemed that the isolation protected them, or the people in these relationships, from the stigma of engaging in deviant sexuality. So the comprehension and the open-mindedness of the people in this community help people feel more welcome and comfortable with being whatever they want it to be or doing whatever they want it to be. Now, this is important because in normal society, they felt too much pressure of stigma and felt that the need to go to an isolated environment or to a different community that would accept them. A third strategy used to deal with the stigma is innovate new roles and language to best deal with custodial issues. So part of this study that was done by Chef in 2011 was done through in-depth interviews of about 40 participants. Now there was another part to this, but that required more article-based reviews, and that was done on same-sex couples. But to focus right now on the interviews, they were semi-structured interviews that lasted from 1.5 hours to 2 hours. The initial questions were about demographic characteristics, entry into polyamory, and current relationships. In the second round, it was more pointed questions about parenting, their relationship with their partners, their biolegal kin, their definitions of the family, and their interactions with institutions. Now, the findings that came from this were that labels such as co-parents and other labels were used as a form of trying to identify their partners in society. And sometimes this was used, or mostly this was used, to avoid stigma of being judged for having more than one partner, or not knowing what to call your partner out in society. Now, one other important thing to note from this is that the research was alongside same-sex couples, so this was further verified in his findings that polyamorous couples are very similar to same-sex couples when it comes to the stigma that they face. Now we will move on to discussing about the media. Polyamorous relationships are talked about in the media in a less than favorable way. But in the articles that I was able to find, I was able to see a different perspective, such as in an article that I found in The Guardian written by Fry, in which she discusses her experience of being in a polyamorous relationship. She goes on to say in this article that, quote, "I'm usually met with fear and confusion." She goes on to defend her side of the relationship and how it is not very different from other relationships when it comes to the ups and the downs of just being in a regular relationship. In another article that I found in the Chicago Tribune by Mosley, there is a lot of positive discussion when it comes to trying to explain what polyamorous relationships are about. And this is done by interviewing the locals and asking researchers about the definition of polyamory. There is a quote by a Chicago native who is in a polyamorous relationship that really paints a good picture of what it means to be in that kind of relationship. Quote, "People hear the word polyamory and they focus so much on the first syllable and not the second. Quote, they get so tangled up in the multiple partners aspect that they don't pay attention to the love part. That's all that it is, the ability to love more people." As seen from the media, polyamorous relationships are not widely known in society, and it will take some time for more people to become educated on this topic. That being said, people in these relationships are still facing a lot of stigma. A lot of stigma that is very similar to what same-sex couples initially received when they came into the society's eye and are probably still receiving today. It is because of these ties and similarities between them that the stigmas they face are also very similar. This, of course, means that they can use similar strategies to deal with them. Now, there have been articles in the media that I've recently discussed that are trying to educate people and to help people understand this new form of family. But as I mentioned, it will take some time for them to either accept it or just become aware that it is happening in society. I believe this field is important to study, for we do not fully understand the implications that this form of family can have. It can help some people find what's best suited for them when it comes to relationships. We can't just exclude a form of family that is up and coming simply because it has not been researched enough or because there are stigmas against it saying that it shouldn't exist. We still do not know the benefits or harm it can have to society, and I feel that that is worth further investigation.